to talk about features of connected speech. And just to provide you with an ongoing running example, I'm going to give the lecture in connected speech. So that's a surprise for you. Anyway, in this lecture, we're going to consider features which are characteristic of connected speech, especially speech at anything above the slow, solemn, and sedate rate of delivery, sometimes known as careful colloquial, which is generally taught to learners in English as a foreign language. There comes a time for advanced learners to examine what goes on in real English speech, the English speech of the real world outside the classroom. Many of the phenomena, many of the things which we discover in English will have counterparts in other languages, including probably, certainly I think, your own mother language, your own L1. All languages modify complicated sequences of sounds in order to simplify the articulation process. But the manner in which this is done varies from one language to another. And furthermore, most native speakers, whether they're English or any other language, they're often very shocked to discover what these simplification processes are when they're pointed out to them. They often think this is bad speech, lazy speech, or slovenly speech is a term I've heard. And all people are talking about very often is the sort of thing I'm going to describe to you, which is characteristic of all speech, all English. But they do look a bit surprising when you see them put into phonetic symbols. And that's the reason why I quite often refer to this, and I put in the title actually, that this is the surprises of connected speech. Now, before I go any further, I must emphasize that what we're dealing with here is English pronounced at a perfectly regular rate of delivery. It's not very fast English. It's not the sort of English you sometimes hear in auction rooms, where the person is trying to go as fast as he can so as to sell as many things as possible in a short space of time. It's not that at all. It's the ordinary, everyday speech that you'll hear all around you. Let's start off by having a look at an important contrast, and that is, incidentally, once again, I'm hoping that Michael will put these PowerPoint slides up on SCEP Online, so you don't need to worry if you miss some of them. More important to get it into your head than to get it onto paper. Here we have an important contrast here, what we can call the ideal form of a word, similar to what is sometimes called the citation form of a word. When you pick a word out and you examine it, you don't have it in the flow of speech, you examine the word concerned, then this is the ideal form. It's the form that you'll see in a pronouncing dictionary. So this is the ideal form of a word. And then we also have the connected speech forms. And these are characteristic of colloquial speech at a normal rate of delivery. That's what we'll be looking at today. And these changes are the result of phonetic conditioning. By that I mean changes which take place because of sounds around the word concerned. So in other words, phonetic conditioning means a change which takes place in context, okay, in the context of speech. And these are part of the process which Bronwyn referred to, the process of co-articulation, where you have overlapping articulations and how they affect each other. So it's the manner in which speech segments then are affected by other adjacent or near adjacent segments. Now, when we take connected speech processes, we have a number of possible effects. Firstly, we have assimilation. That is to say, changing sounds, sounds which change under the influence of other neighbouring sounds. Secondly, we have elision. from the verb to allied. And these are disappearing sounds. These are sounds which vanish, as it were, as if by magic, in the course of the speech. And lastly, we have liaison, and that is to say, appearing sound. You two ladies there, could you please not disturb us all, okay? Thank you. So appearing sounds. These are sounds which appear. These are sounds which are inserted, as it were, to form a link between other neighbouring sounds. Let's have a look first of all at assimilation. And a smart definition of this, and I think it's on your handout, is that when, as a result of phonetic conditioning, one phoneme is replaced by a second under the influence of a third. An example of assimilation is in the word broadcast. In its ideal form, it looks like this: broadcast. But when it's pronounced casually, shall we say, often in perfectly normal speech, a native speaker won't notice it unless you point it out to them. What happens? What happens is it sounds as broadcast, broadcast. In other words, the D is replaced by G, okay, influenced by phoneme 3, so influenced by the velar K. So alveolar replaced by velar under the influence of the velar, the following velar K. Now, this then is a very frequent effect in English. There are many, many examples of different types of assimilation. Some assimilations or some changes are more significant than others. You can have allophonic variation. By allophonic variation, I mean something which changes the allophone, the particular variant of the phoneme, but not sufficient to cross a phoneme boundary. So if I say the word health, maybe you can say it with me. Say health. Health. And if you're pronouncing it correctly, you'll be having a th sound at the end. What happens to the L? The L is alveolar. But what happens is that we anticipate the production of that dental consonant, so the tongue moves forward. So as I pronounce it, I'll say hell. Can you see my tongue between my teeth? Hello. Hell. On the teeth, and then the th afterwards. Health. But that L is not another phoneme. We don't have a different phoneme. So we refer to this as allophonic variation. Whereas in broadcast, we go into another phoneme category. We go from a d rather into a g sound, from a da into a ga. So this is a difference then between allophonic variation as opposed to assimilation. We can also discuss assimilation in terms of directionality. We can distinguish between leading assimilation, which is my term for it, and this is where the sound is anticipated, the following sound is anticipated, and another term which I hate and detest, and which I would suggest that you cross out on your handout and don't use it in future, but unfortunately you'll see it in some books, and that's regressive assimilation. I always get terribly confused with this term because it seems to be the wrong way around. It seems to be going backwards, whereas in actual fact, this is leading. This is going into the next sound. So if I take, well, broadcast was one example, we got another one here, a bit much, it's a bit much, then the bilabial P, the T is turned into a P, and it leads, it introduces a feature of the following bilabial N. Second type of directionality is in the other direction. So lagging assimilation. So also known as perseverative, which is how I pronounce the word, and also, regrettably, as progressive. Once again, I hate the term progressive, and I think you should cross it out, because you will find it in books. That's the reason I put it here. You will find some books, particularly written by phonologists, who refer to it, but I don't like the term myself. I like the term for this lagging assimilation, because that's what happens. You have an articulation, the articulators lag, they slow down, as it were, and they keep the position of the sound that's come before. This is very common with features of the dental fricatives in English, where very often you will find that in the corner is pronounced just with a long N, in the corner. I always have to think to say it, in fact, in its ideal form, in the corner. I have to think to say that. Try saying it that way. A good way of cheating. A nice way of cheating. Avoiding saying this difficult the sound. Try saying it in the corner. Make it a long N. It isn't a separate N. In the corner. Everybody? In the corner. That's it. Right. Good. And if you say that to an English person and say, do you notice anything funny in what I'm saying? What on earth are you saying? What are you talking about? I can't hear anything at all. What are you talking about? And until you actually point it out to them, then they usually won't even be able to hear it. Third type of directionality is what we can call reciprocal assimilation. That's a rather smart word, so if you want to, you just call it two-way assimilation. And one of the ways in which you'll find this in English is what is known as yod coalescence. Again, a very smart way. It's good to have these long words, you know, because if somebody says, what did you do on SCEP? Well, you can say, well, I fell asleep through most of the lectures, and I went out and had a good drink in the evening, and there was a good Indian restaurant just down. Nobody's going to be impressed. But if, on the other hand, you say, oh, we learnt about lagging assimilation, and we learnt about yod coalescence, then everybody will think, oh, this really must be a great thing. Great things you've been doing in London town. Well done. Obviously, you've used all your funding very wisely. Example, for instance, this year, which can easily be said as this year. In fact, I have to think to say it any other way. This year. Try saying it. Say the ideal way, first of all. This year. And then say it the assimilated way. This year. Ear, of course, in year can be pronounced as ear, or it can be pronounced as one of these words which can be pronounced in two different ways, as far as the vowels are concerned. Now this means that features are exchanged in both directions, and both the underlying phonemes in the sequence are affected by it. We can then go on to consider types of assimilation. So you have assimilation of place. This is where, obviously, it affects the place of articulation. A short time, last year I think I noticed this. It was in a magazine, and it was saying how students these days didn't know how to speak English, or didn't know how to spell English. And it showed a picture of a student placard, some sort of revolutionary thing, saying we must do our utmost to achieve this, that, or the other. And it was actually showed this placard. What's happening there, of course, is you have utmost, and you have the alveolar T replaced by bilabial P as a result of assimilation, and so you have utmost. Incidentally, with a lot of these T assimilations, what else do you hear? Utmost. Yeah? Glottal stop. So that you have glottalization taking place at the same time with a lot of these assimilations. You may even have glottal replacement, namely that you have glottal stop replacing the sound concerned. Alveolar consonants are indeed the most commonly affected by assimilation of place, so you'll constantly find that the assimilations are affecting T, D, S, Z. These are the ones which are most likely to be affected. A second type of assimilation is what's known as assimilation of voice. This affects the fortis-lenis contrast, so another term for it is assimilation of energy. But most books use the term assimilation of voice. This is a danger in English because there are actually very few examples of it. In many languages, so for instance in Dutch, to give one example, also in French, one finds that assimilation of voice is the most important type of assimilation, it's most frequent. But in English, for some reason or other, English is rather fussy about voice. It's rather fussy about fortis-lenis. I sometimes say that one difference between English and a lot of other languages is that the end of a word is as important as the beginning of a word. And English is very, a lot of words are distinguished in meaning by the coda. And so this is maybe the reason that we have rather rare, you have to search around for examples of voice assimilation in English. The one example which we can find is of course. Of is often very much affected by connected speech processes. So of course, where the V, the phonetic V of in its ideal form, of in its weak form, turns into an F, a voiceless F, of course. Another example is newspaper. Regular pronunciation of that word, where you'd expect to have news as newspaper. But, an important one is have to, where have to means must. Only where have to means must, not where it's possessive, not I have to, but I have two of them. But have to where it means must. So you always have, and that's obligatory. And so you have to remember that you have to pronounce have to as have to. So there you are, you can remember that. You have to pronounce have to as have to. And the V there turns into an F, as I think you'll be able to hear. A third type of influence is where you have manner of articulation affected. So if I gave you the example before, in the corner, all the books, we have here a fricative turning, in the case of all the books, to the lateral and lateral proximant, and in the corner a fricative turns into a nasal. I just remind you again, a little note underneath there, saying in passing, this is a very common feature of colloquial English, and many books ignore its significance. But it's all you have to do is listen, and you'll hear that this is very, very frequent with English speakers, though they will find it very strange if you ask them that. Assimilation processes co-occur. That is to say, they take place at the same time. So if you have something like should you, that's a reciprocal assimilation there, two-way assimilation, you have both place and manner operating there. So the D and the Y change both in terms of place and manner of articulation. And also, more than one phoneme may be affected simultaneously by the same type of articulation. So if I say front page, it's on the front page, then you have NT there in the ideal form, and that's then affected by the bilabial, and it becomes front page. What else do you hear there? Front page, glottal stop. You're likely to have it pre-glottalized. So let me go back. You may think I am I have a hobby horse, as we say here in English, something which I find, an obsession. You'd be right. This lagging assimilation involving dental fricative is very significant, and we've got a couple of examples here, all basically the same principle. Let's have a go with them. Try saying them the way I'm suggesting. On the shelves, everybody.
On the shelves.
All the time.
All the time.
So it's much easier than trying to say that, isn't it? What's the matter?
What's the matter?
How's the business?
How's the business?
Okay, now the point is that you cannot say this, big warning sign, okay, you cannot use these assimilations if you're speaking very, very slowly. You cannot say in the corner. Sounds ridiculous. You cannot say all the time. So you have to have a reasonable rate of delivery before you can manage to get away, as it were, with these assimilations. Mostly they affect unstressed syllables, though we'll find, in fact, that you can get stressed syllables with this in it as well. The most commonly affected word is the. A difference is still to be heard, except at very, very rapid tempo, possibly. A difference is still to be heard between the and so the and a, as a result of the lengthening of the segment and the possible differences in the rhythm. So I can make a difference between the these two, in the tube, so I'll say it now with an assimilation, in the tube, long N, and if I say in a tube, then you'll still hear the difference between those two. In rapid speech, I think it probably is often lost, and you tell which it is from context. If you say, I had a difficult journey standing in the tube, then people aren't really going to think that you're somehow or other, you've been beamed along a tube from some place to another. They'll really think that you've been on the underground. Right. The next type of assimilation, the next type of connected speech process we want to discuss is elision. Elision, from the verb to elide, we say a sound is elided. This involves the deletion of a phoneme from the ideal form. Now, last year, I saw two examples of this, though I've seen one of them many times. There is such a thing in Britain as a steamed pudding. A steamed pudding is a pudding which has been cooked by steam. But sometimes you'll see it written on menus as steam pudding, which gives me the impression that it's a pudding made out of steam. Occasionally when you eat it, you wish it was made out of steam, or indeed made out of almost anything else. But that's by the way. But you can see here the reality of this, and that is that people think in terms of these elisions, and like utmost, It's these spelling errors are evidence that people are actually thinking in terms of these. I also saw last year in Sainsbury's reduce to a pound instead of reduced to a pound. And these are all perfectly frequent types of elision. Elision often takes place when you have a sequence of 3 consonants and the middle one of the sequence is either a T or a D, particularly so with T, but either a T or a D. Some other examples, they're compressed files. Compressed files, once again, you have the same sort of effect. Now we can have a slight diversion here to consider what's happened in the course of history with assimilation. Some of the assimilation processes we've talked about have affected the pronunciation of words, as it were, permanently. So you have there what we term an historical assimilation, or elision. And you can see, as opposed to contemporary, which is what we're talking about, what's going on at the moment. And two often quoted examples are the word cupboard, which presumably started out as cupboard, a board on which you place cups. And another one is Christmas, which presumably started off as Christ Mass, holiday for Christ, and then weakened the last syllable, and then had an elision process. So nowadays, the only possible pronunciation is Christmas. If you've been saying Christmas, then the T can't be pronounced in standard English. Consonant elision, then, most likely to be affected, in particular plosives T and D, when one occurs as the central element of a sequence of three consonants. So some more examples: past tense, ruin the market, left luggage, a failed test. These are all real examples, things which I've actually heard people say, or I've heard on radio. Vowel elision is another feature. So the elision of schwa in unstressed syllables, and particularly where this comes before certain sonorant consonants, L, R, and N. So say the examples of this: history, from history, travelling becomes travelling, federal becomes federal. You see, I'm making errors here because I'm so used to pronouncing the non-ideal form, I have to think about it. Once again, this is the source of many spelling errors. So you find that native speakers very often make spelling errors along these lines. Very, very common in colloquial English, often making words somewhat easier to say. So if you have something like temporary, all those schwas get in the way, don't they? Temporary. Much easier to pronounce it as temporary, which is the way in which English people regularly pronounce this word. Now, the next process that we have to consider is where sounds appear. And the sounds which appear are termed liaison. So you'll find that, I think I've gone ahead. Yes, I have. Mine's, let me go back, because what I'm supposed to do is there we go. PowerPoint and I have a constant battle, and PowerPoint usually emerges as the winner. So if you now look, I think, at your handout, you'll be able to see what I'll be talking about for the next few minutes. And these are some notable elisions which haven't been covered by what I've said before. So have a look at the handout on page 65? 66 of your booklet. H is regularly elided from the weak forms of grammar words, function words. So if you have something like, I think he will have told her, this is likely to come out as, I think he will have told her. This is to be heard even in formal speech registers, all varieties of English. It's never heard if it begins an intonational phrase, so it's never heard there. But it's because of the linguistic insecurity attached to H dropping, as it's known in English accents. H is the big shibboleth, the big social marker in English. Dropping H's, not pronouncing H's, is regarded as being a very uneducated speech by some people. And because of this, it's not at all uncommon for English children to be corrected by teachers for not pronouncing H's in these circumstances. But in actual fact, H-dropping of this sort, that is to say, in function words in weak syllables, this is very common. Another notable elision for weak forms is the deletion of dental fricative in them. And this produces a written form, as you can see here. It's often seen in conversation, Yesterday, I managed to produce 2 of these when I was talking to Brian in the coffee shop, and we had been told off the day before by one of the people there for not taking our cups back. And so I said to Brian, put them on the trolleys, and there's a good example of this form. It's associated with informal speech, but of course it can be a useful way of getting rid of yet another of those dental fricatives. Is it a recent development? No, I'm afraid it isn't. You can trace it back to, well, I'm not a history of the language person, but I think at least to the 13th century. Can't you, Adrian, leave to... you'll find it in Chaucer, often spelled M, so it's a very old thing, but it's still knocking around. 2 common words which have alternative forms with elision of dental fricatives. So the word months can be pronounced as I've just pronounced it. You don't need to say the th. You can stick in a T if you want to, but you don't need to say months. And certainly don't say something like months, which I've heard people say. So a very easy way of pronouncing it, it's in the pronouncing dictionaries, is just to say months. And then you can also pronounce close without the, and just like close the door. This doesn't mean to say that months or clothes is wrong. No, 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 that's perfectly okay. It's just that as non-natives, you may find these forms easier to say, and nobody will notice it unless you actually point it out to them. Once again, very often, if you talk to people who aren't phoneticians, aren't linguists, they'll tell you these pronunciations are incorrect. But have a look in the dictionaries, you'll discover that what they say isn't true. Forms of numerals. If you have to say something like 3/5 or 5/12, you don't need to say the F. I'd like to tell you you don't need to say the th, but that isn't true. But you can elide the F in these difficult sequences. Elision of V and of is very common, particularly before the, and makes it easier to say. 3 other websites, 1 of the lads. Very frequent way of pronouncing that. I have to think to say the V, the phonetic V there. 3 of the websites. I don't normally say it. I elide it. Also heard at more rapid tempo before other consonants. A piece of paper. A matter of fact. The sequence TT is reduced to a single T and has to be reduced to a single T in 3 common verb forms. So in ought to, want to, got to. So as in, we ought to visit him. I want to leave. They've got to go now. And when going to is a tense former, you'll hear that in colloquial English, it's regularly pronounced as gonna. You'll sometimes see it represented in books, in where they show conversation, as gonna. People don't say gonna, but they do say gonna very, very frequently, very commonly. I'd say it's probably the most common way of saying this form. Once again, if you ask a native speaker about it, they'll tell you that it's wrong, or it's slang, or it's lazy speech, or something of the sort. And then, if you listen to them 2 minutes later, they'll probably be using it themselves without realizing it. Don't mention it to them. People get very cross when you do that sort of thing. Then going to, when it's a tense former, what's going to happen? I'm going to go there. Okay? All of these you'll find very, very frequently in colloquial English. Now I'm going to go back to using the PowerPoint, which I hope. Give us the forms of liaison. And liaison is where in non-rhotic accents, and liaison of this sort applies only to non-rhotic accents. You get liaison, of course, in other languages as well. It's very common in French, for instance. But it's where you have an historic final R surfacing across word boundaries as if the following word across word boundaries if the following word begins with a vowel. So you have, for instance, far, my speech, no R, no trace of an R. Farmer, no R. But if I say far away, then suddenly the R appears as a link. And if I say the farmer isn't here, then once again you have the R appearing as a link form. A couple of things to say about it. Don't get yourself in a suicidal mood if you miss one of these R's. Nobody will notice, actually. You'll be the only person who does. And even though these R's are said very, very frequently, people don't notice if you miss one out. So don't let it rule your linguistic life. It's indeed something which you'll hear people producing regularly, but if you miss one out, it's not an error in the sense of something which need worry you. Then we have the famous intrusive R. And this is something which you'll find that quite a lot of non-phonetic people know about. It's something which is, you sometimes see people talking about in the newspapers. And it's, once again, something which is confined to non-rhotic languages, so not non-rhotic forms of language, so not, for instance, in American English. The context and the phonetic effect is the same as for linking R, but there's no historical justification for the surfacing R, since there's no R in the orthography, no R in the spelling. Intrusive R occurs after central and open front vowels, and here we have examples of that. So data, which is a central schwa, the data in the report. Then after a near vowel, the idea of it, the very idea of it. Then after a back vowel, I saw Elision yesterday. And then if you pronounce this word as R, cinema, I don't normally, I usually say cinema, still, but you can talk about cinema audiences. What's the advice to the learner as far as this is concerned? Well, what I would do if I were you is I'd regard intrusive R as an interesting phenomenon which you hear from native speakers, but I wouldn't personally imitate it myself. I say it all the time. You know, I have intrusive R's on toast for breakfast in the morning. I have a full range of intrusive R's, as indeed many educated speakers of English have. Most educated speakers of British English, I think, have. There are no social implications whatsoever. It's not lazy speech, it's not slovenly or anything of that sort. For instance, I've heard prime ministers, I mean, they're prestigious people, aren't they? Tony Blair, one example I heard of him saying about Geneva, the town Geneva, and he talked about the Geneva Revidence. And even earlier prime minister, a couple of decades ago, you heard of Margaret Thatcher. And Margaret Thatcher, Lady Thatcher, she's known as the Iron Lady. She's still alive and kicking, though kicking not quite as formidably as she used to. But anyway, she was sometimes called, because she went on about law and order, and how important it was to have law and order in the country, and she was called Laura. Laura Norder, because she usually pronounced this, indeed, with an intrusive R. Personally, I don't recommend it to people who are producing, who are learning English as a foreign language. The reason I don't is because I would be a little wary about using it in America, for instance, because I find if you use intrusive R to Americans, they sort of giggle and say, oh, isn't that funny, isn't that cute? And roll around in the gutter laughing. You also find the same effect with Scots. I'm married to a Scot, and if she wants to annoy me, which is quite often the case, my wife will pick on an intrusive R and then repeat it very slowly after me. So I think what you want to do, you don't want to be conspicuous as a non-native, and I think what you want to do is listen to it, find it interesting, perhaps mention it to your class as I am at the moment, but avoid it in your own speech. Well, now, I hope that you're... bye-bye PowerPoint. I hope that you've now learnt something in this class about the surprises of connected speech, and you realise that you need to be aware of them for understanding English, and that sometimes they will simplify sequences, particularly sequences of consonants for you, and you can use this information to improve the fluency of your own English. And that's the end of what I have to say, so may I thank you for being a very kind and attentive audience over these 4 lectures that I've given you.